of any of it.
Okay, so our topic today was writing a letter to one of the characters. So I guess I'll read my letter, and then people can volunteer to read theirs. So I kind of based mine off of letter 4, and I was writing
Hey
to.
Kylie, sorry
yeah,
to cut you off. This won't work.
Cool.
There should be another thing.
Yeah.
Oh, don't do this. I mean, use this because there's a lag time.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
We figured it out.
Yeah, there you go.
Are you good now?
Yeah, we're good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I based mine off of letter 4, and I was writing to Gilgamesh, like concerning his fear of death. So I guess I'll just read it. Okay. Keep on as you have, and work to inhabit a tranquil state of mind. You will experience a considerable amount of pleasure during the process of conquering your fear of death. I first learned of your fear when you said, I shall die, and shall I not be then as Enkidu? Sorrow has entered my heart. I am afraid of death, so I wander the wild to find Buddha Nafishti. In Tablet 9, lines 2 through 5 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. You must surely remember the great joy you felt when life seemed simple and the two of you lived lives side by side. Always make progress, and you shall discover that there are some things that we should not fear, for they will only bring more fear to us. Make life pleasant for yourself by casting away all anxiety regarding the matter at hand. As I expressed in letter 4 of Selected Letters, paragraph 9, why deceive yourself and only now realize that you have been on the way to death since you were born? Fearing death will not change your final destination, therefore do not agonize yourself with concrete concepts of human existence. There is no person who does not hold the power of life and death over you. Consider these thoughts in your heart as your time goes by in order to obtain tranquility during your last hour, since this fear of death torments all your remaining hours. Immortality cannot be achieved due to the limits the law of nature imposes on us. We are provided with only the necessities of life. Men waste away concerning themselves with uncontrollable matters, causing their death to come sooner and not living life to its fullest potential. What is enough is within our grasp. Keep well. So, would anyone like to volunteer to read the letter next?
It's kind of funny because I also wrote to the about his fear of death. My dear King, I would like to offer my deepest condolences on your recent loss of a friend. Even though not a human, Enkidu has more than enough proof that he is worthy of being one. His passing was great misfortune, and I fear that you, out of everyone, have been the most pained. Afraid of your own inevitable death, you ventured out into the wilderness to find the gift of immortality, but came back empty-handed, which changed you for the better. For that, I believe the journey wasn't fruitless. However, I still would like to offer counsel on the matter. Epicurus, one of the highly influential philosophers, who is the founder of Epicureanism, has found a way to tackle death and come to terms with it. In his letter to Menicius, Epicurus says, so death, the most frightening of bad things, is nothing to us. Since we exist, death is not yet present, and when death is present, then we do not exist. To him, death is but a sensation to the soul, so as the soul destroyed, we should feel nothing. Therefore, king, be the best that you can be, for unlike death, the fleeting life is the most precious thing. Never stop from burying yourself. Keep well.
Excellent. Time out. Can I just about these things? So this is a good example in writing these letters. I want you to be sure to observe the same conventions that you are to observe in your other written assignments, right? Okay. And those conventions are what?
Quotes.
What's that?
Quotes and citations. Do you want us to say those? Or not?
Well, the style guide, okay, so yes, you have to document things, but in the little citations in parentheses, that's fine. Okay, but what are the principles? What are the guidelines? Because we've got some new people in here.
Not using generic, like overarching things.
That's right. No generalizations, okay? You can only speak for yourself, right? You cannot speak for humankind or left-handed people or whatever, okay? You can only speak for yourself, right? What else?
Avoid adjectives.
Avoid adjectives and adverbs, absolutely, absolutely, right? Just give the data, right? Because adjectives and adverbs are subjective judgments, right? And they invite, it's very difficult to establish or to support subjective judgments, right? Okay, what else? I should know these by heart right now.
Avoid passive voice.
Avoid the passive voice, absolutely, right.
There's avoid generalization.
Oh yeah, we got that one. Yep, that's good. Now, one of them is to avoid the second person, okay, but that's obviously, it does not apply to writing a letter like this, right? Okay, right?
Like gendered things.
That's right. We use inclusive language, right, to the extent that it's possible. Yeah. Very good. Excellent. Good. Right. So, just to remind you that this should be in a very Senecan way. I'm going to be like a little Seneca here to my Lucaii, okay? That you practice these conventions even in the smallest of things, and that will make it better for when you have to practice them in the larger. That's right. Okay, very good. Thank you, Kali. Excellent. Thanks, guys.
Does anyone else want to volunteer first? Towns, readers?
Yeah, let me say a few things before I hop into this. Mine was a little more conversational than the other two, and I deeply regret doing it that way. But it's too late, so I guess we'll just do it. My dearest Abraham, as your longtime friend, I find it necessary to be forthright with you about your current situation. In your last letter, you mentioned that you were bummed out about having to sacrifice your son Isaac, Genesis 22. My advice? You gotta get over it, bud. I mean, I get it, I really do. Killing your own son, it's like, ugh, I don't want to do that. You know, understandable, totally. But think about it this way. No suffering is great if it has an end. Yeah? Huh? Like, I know, crazy, right? You're probably thinking like, what? But, I'll explain. Death is coming to you. No, there's no debate about that. No two ways about it. It's just, it is what it is, But it must either not reach you or pass you by. Let that sink in for a second, right? In other words, death isn't really something to be feared. It's always with us. We can't live our lives in fear of what's inevitable, so there's really no point in worrying about your death or that of others. You just gotta relax, Besides, this came from the boss man upstairs, right? So no real way to wiggle yourself out of this one, huh? Just as well, though, these things do happen for a reason. And sure, it's not the easiest thing in the world, the whole son killing and all that, but, this will make you stronger, mark my words. God, who so loves good men and wants them to be good, as virtuous as possible, assigns to them a fortune that will make them struggle. From On Providence. It's a good read. See? Not all so bad. At least, you get out of that. You get that out of it, So, good talking with you. Best of luck with the whole son execution thing. Let me know how it goes. And don't do it in an arena setting. Don't really care for that. And yours truly, Seneca. That's what I had. So, yeah, thank you.
Now you're intimidating everyone else counts, thanks.
Yeah, good stuff.
Okay, who wants to go next?
There's the bar. So.
Regardless, my mom would suck regardless of what kind. So I wrote mine to Achilles, kind of the same thing about the idea of fear of death. So Achilles, I am sorry for the loss of your close friend Patroclus. I understand this time must be challenging, but you must not allow yourself to wither away. Continue caring for yourself, and listen to King Priam and eat. Seneca says in his letter to Achilles that the most shameful loss is the loss due to carelessness. That's letter 1, paragraph 1. You may now know that because of your actions, your death will come soon, according to your prophecy. Don't fear the end, and don't worry about how long you have left. You cannot change the decisions that you have made. Like Seneca writes in his 4th letter, no man can have a carefree life if he devotes too much concern to prolonging it. That's from paragraph 4, letter 4. Farewell, Achilles, and remember to work through life's troubles and not fear them.
Nice.
Thanks.
Rhonda, do you want to do yours?
Okay. So context, is I am besties with Jonathan and David since day one. It's the ultimate trio, Roma, Jonathan, and David. So it says, Dear David, and this is before David does all of that stuff.
Right.
Dear David, now that you are king, I urge you to take my advice as one of your oldest friends. I want only the best for you, and I will leave you with these pieces of advice. First, be wary of crowds of people. The wise Seneca said in his 7th letter, the bigger the crowd, the greater the danger. You are doing exactly what is planned for you, and you have overcome great odds to get where you are today. And it's a quote, so his goodness is complete if it has fulfilled the purpose for which he was born. Do not let yourself with this newfound fame forget your purpose and be overcome by crowds. There have always been different statuses between me, you, and Jonathan. I am the only one who has stayed in nobility and not encountered any turmoil. Keep in mind that Jonathan once held more power than you, and as Seneca says in letter 47, treat your slaves humanely and like how you would want to be treated if you were one, because everyone is a slave to themselves. Now, I consider myself to be one of your oldest and most loyal friends. For years, you, Jonathan, and I have placed our trust in each other. Without even realizing it as a child, we all judged each other's character, deeming one worthy of friendship or not. Like Seneca's 3rd letter says, think long whether someone should be taken into your friendship. When you decide on it, welcome him with your whole heart. Many people will approach you now, claiming old ties or new temptations. Hold near the ones that you have trusted as friends your whole life, and be wary of people's malintentions for you. From Roma.
Okay, so I also wrote to Gilgamesh, I apologize, about his fear of death. So.
That marks you truly as a member of this
Yeah.
colloquium.
Alright.
And where did we get that? Why do we say Gilgamesh?
It's got the
With that
mark
accent.
above it.
Yeah, in George's edition, it talks about the pronunciation of these things, right? And we have a little accent on the A, so that's why we do it. We're just following what appears to be scholarly evidence, right? There you go. Thank you.
Alright. So I said, in our recent correspondence, I've seen you struggling with your own mortality and the wish to be godly and reach a state of immortality. While I do find this struggle to be common and well documented, it is unfounded. Death is something we cannot escape, and in fact is something of a blessing and a gift to us. Our physical form will die eventually, but our souls will live forever. So a certain part of ourselves will live on forever, just not your physical form. It is in fact only in death that we find true peace and pleasure, once in the absence of our corporeal form. Our physical forms are indeed the source of our pain, and it is the, quote, escape from the prison house of our bodies, Scipio 19, that can provide us with peace. Once we have left our bodies, our souls find peace in their eternity, and thus you have no reason to be concerned with the temporary existence of your form. For the time being, you must not concern yourself so greatly with the fact of death. Quote, no man can have a carefree life if he devotes too much concern to prolonging it. Seneca, letter 4, paragraph 4. A preoccupation with life and death can only cause more suffering, and an acceptance of such facts is most important.
Okay.
Gosh. Okay, so we have to Hecuba about not just her loss. Wait, dear Hecuba, I know that you find yourself in a horrible situation following the fall of your city and the loss of your status as Queen of Troy. With you now finding yourself a slave to the very Greeks that have caused the death of so many of your family members. However, do not despair or become overcome by hopelessness and grief. When the Stoic writer Seneca wrote to Marcia, following her child's death, he used examples of different women who have experienced loss like this, like the two of you have experienced, to illustrate the differences between allowing yourself to be reduced to uncontrolled sadness or to grieve and continue on living. Seneca obviously advises the following option, saying, it is not nature's will that we will be broken by grief. 60. Basically, by using Seneca's words, I wish to convey that you should continue on without letting your emotions further ruin the remainder of your life, and instead seek freedom from them by showing indifference to fortune. 84.
Also, I know that in your life may seem a better option than spending the rest of your life in servitude to the enemies of a foreign land, but while I heavily advise against it, Seneca would say, I have it right here. But as you know, life is not always worth holding on to, since it is good to live, but to live well. And I hope that you ultimately decide not to follow that, but understand if you do.
Is there a Brittany?
I also wrote to Achilles, pretending like he put more thought into whether he should go to war and die early or not, based off of letter 70. Even though it's not really suicide, but he knows he's going to die, so I counted it. You are given a prophecy looking forwards upon your death that decreed that you may live a long and unknown life or a short and glorious one. Perhaps, given the amount of hardship you have already experienced and the dubious outlook of the war you are currently fighting, the former option seems better. However, I write to persuade you that there is no shame in choosing an early death. As Seneca says, a longer life is not better at all costs. While choosing the shorter path and going into battle with the knowledge that it will lead to your death is not exactly the same as committing suicide, I believe similar principles can be applied, because you are fundamentally choosing when and how you leave this world. When debating whether or not to return to the fight, keep in mind that to refrain from fighting in order to avoid your own death is not the most honorable decision. We should not run from pain when it gives us the opportunity to prove ourselves to other men and to God. Many philosophers argue that suicide is unnatural and therefore wrong, that people should allow themselves to be taken from the world when nature decrees it. But nature has given you an option here, and given that agency, I would urge you to choose the latter option. Free yourself from the loss of your companion, your forced war, and your prophecy. The shorter path is also the more painful one, therefore you should not worry that you are being dishonorable by running away from hardship or pain. While it will free you from your emotional burdens, it is not free of all pain, and since you have been given the choice, there is no shame in taking it.
I also wrote to Gilgamesh, and I wrote it as if he was on after Enkidu, I think that's it.
I think that's it, right?
Enkidu died, and so he's rooting for him and is wandering, searching for immortality. The death of a friend is bound to bring forth feelings of grief and fear, as you were not anticipating his passing, and it was a great shock. However, these feelings of grief for his death and fear for your own death must be overcome for you to live life well. Do not let the wound of your grief fester, because if it does, your mourning will overwhelm you, and you will not be able to cherish the time you spent with him. Roaming the wilderness and leaving Uruk will only make the wound grow, so you must return to Uruk and not show your grief in performing duties as king. In this way, you can mourn for Enkidu, but only as much as you should. Appreciate the time you spent with him and understand that death is inevitable. Do not mourn that his life ended early. Measure the quality of life instead of the quantity of years. Even though his life was short, grief did not mold you into a better man or defeat Humbaba or the bull of heaven with you. Cherish these memories and remember that he lived a good life. In regard to your own fear of death, remember that death is always approaching and has been since birth. It is pointless to fear something certain to pass, as this fear will only cause unnecessary agony. Seneca said, "No man can have a carefree life if he devotes too much concern to prolonging it," in letter 4, paragraph 4. So do not seek immortality. Instead, cultivate the tranquility of your mind by rejecting your fear, so that you are able to live pleasantly and well. Keep well.
Carl, do you want to read your letter?
Shockingly, I also wrote about the death of Enkidu. How do you say
Mhm.
not
Good. Enkidu is good,
not,
yes.
not Gilgamesh, but
Gilgamesh.
Gilgamesh. So sorry to hear about the passing of your great friend Enkidu. I hear that you were not coping with his passing too terribly well. A true friend is difficult to find. A friend that you can share everything with, the good, the bad, and everything in between. A true friend is someone whom you will follow to the ends of the earth, which I hear you are currently attempting to do. From what I understand about your friendship with Enkidu, he will be doing the exact same thing for you. However, I must ask you, what are you really attempting to do? If you are looking for a way to bring a friend back from the dead, know that it does not exist. Bringing loved ones back is a power we mere mortals are not meant to have. It is well known that our lives are short and fleeting, and we are not meant to live in this world forever. Do not wallow in the fact that your friend is no longer with you. Instead, remember the great times that you had, the opportunity to share together. Death is the finality of all. It is reserved for us in the end. It is completely unavoidable. I will die, you will die, we will all die. It is the one fact of life here on earth that we can always count on. I hope that on your quest you come to realize this and become a better person for recognizing that death waits for us all.
Tim, do you have your letter? Yeah.
I wrote to David. It's just about like not acting on certain emotions. So, my dearest David, as I read more and more about your endeavors and your service to the people of the kingdom of Israel and Judah and Yahweh himself, I cannot help but put you on a very high, what did I say? I cannot help but form a very high opinion of you, especially after your conquering of Goliath. It was impossible to not put your likeness on the highest pedestal. But after hearing of your affair with Bathsheba, which resulted in her getting pregnant and then sending off her husband to die in one of your conquests, Dave, you can't do that. Your role is to represent and lead the children of Abraham, or Yahweh's chosen people, to prosperity and sovereignty. Breaking up the marriage of two of your loyal subjects and then sending one of them to die is not very king-like. In addition, the first child that was born out of this cacophony, Absalom, was fated to die from the start. You giving into your lustful desires resulted in 2 losses of life. While your sin against Yahweh and his commandments were once forgiven, the scar of having 2 innocents killed will remain with you forever. So in the future, act as a true sage and hold these feelings in check and do not act on them. Your future relative, Tim.
Alright. I did mine. And it was Naya. One cannot be afraid of physical pain. Once the loss is unavoidable, it is more easier to accept it. Death is the most easiest because it will always be with us. Like said in letter 4 of Seneca, make life pleasant for yourself by casting away all anxiety about it. And it being, the death that's coming sooner or later. Your death is definite, of course. Therefore, there's no going back. So the quicker that you will accept it and your fate as the sacrificial lamb will help you not fear death. Think of it like as our bodies as only vessels for our souls. And once it's over, you will be in a place that no one on earth has ever been before. And then you'll experience new things that you have never experienced while on this planet. So don't trip over the things that are to come, but be grateful for the things that are to come after.
Okay, so I was. Does anyone, did you know anything interesting that you wanted to discuss? Kitty, did you want to share about this?
So I have some observations. So you have really sort of 3 main themes that have come out of this, right? I think it's interesting that many of you chose to write to Gilgamesh, and to Achilles, David. That the main issues seem to be friendship, fear of death, suicide. The question of suicide comes up, and I do want us to talk a little bit more about that. So I think in general the application of Seneca's letters was really interesting and very compelling. I want to come back to this. One of the questions that this raises. This is true. For example, in Towns' letter to Abraham, right? That from a Roman perspective, Abraham was in a lawful position to take the life of his son if he wanted to. Okay, he had the use nitai nekisqua the right of life and death over Isaac. So it does raise the question of, so Abraham feels like he has to sacrifice his son, right? So, and he's anguishing over this. Okay, so from a Roman point of view, you could say, Abraham, you can do this, right? You are fully, from our perspective, you are legally, you have the legal right to do this. But the question would then be mercy, right? And so the question is, am I going to exert mercy, which we saw, for example, Seneca, we didn't read these particular essays, but he has or letters, he has a long essay dedicated to Nero about mercy, right? So exercising the virtue, if you will, go back to Aristotle, of mercy or obedience, right? Obedience to Yahweh. I mean, I think this is a really interesting thing. And it does raise certain questions and issues about Abraham's behavior. Or also the nature of divinity. Yahweh, this force seems to have been imposed upon you. Is this the sort of thing that a deity would do? Is this our concept of deity? So I do think that all of these situations really raise, that you have raised interesting things that you could approach from a Roman point of view that would make them even more nuanced, right? And to actually sit down with the issues and to disentangle them and look at them individually. Brittany's really interesting notion about Achilles understanding that going to war at Troy would trigger a what we might consider a premature death. And it does raise the question about suicide. I mean, you've raised this, and this is something that we should talk about in the context of Stoicism in the Roman world. The Stoics believed, as you know, if you've read this, that the Stoics believed in a mechanistic, to a certain extent, a mechanistic universe, right? A universe that divine forces set into motion with the best intentions, if you will, of human beings in mind, right? That they created this universe, and this universe is for our benefit as human beings. It's basically what the Stoic idea is. The Stoics did not necessarily believe in actual deities, right? In a Jupiter, for example, that would throw a lightning bolt, right? They believed in a more broader system of fortuna, if you will, that regulated human affairs. And so the Stoics have a hard time reconciling what happens on an individual basis and connecting it to some sort of divine influence. Okay, this is one of the ways in which Stoicism sort of wrestles with its own sort of its own metaphysics and the way it understands the universe. So they did believe that that the soul lived after death, and so consequently they developed this notion that if one, for example, had a terminal disease, if one was going to die eventually by means of some sort of fate, as in Achilles' case, or if it was inevitable, it was better to die, to commit suicide, to take one's own life, than to live in some way dishonorably. Okay, so they would pose in these questions: if you're living and you are required to commit some moral outrage, it's better to take one's life, okay, than do that. Right? It's better to take one's life than to suffer needlessly. Right? If one, for example, has a terminal disease, it is senseless to prolong it and to suffer the pain and the consequences of a debilitating degenerative disease, for example. So they had a very sort of different way of looking at life. And Seneca, we'll read. It's not something that I've assigned this time, but I don't think I've assigned it. Well, anyway, if I have, we'll talk about it. So the notion that and this is, of course, Socrates is the person. He committed suicide, right? In his defense, it seemed as though he was engineering his own death, right? Cato, one of the great sort of moral exempla for the Roman world, has also committed suicide. And Seneca also, when Nero asks him to end his life, he does so. And there's a really interesting passage in Tacitus's Annales that describes this confrontation or the the discussions between Seneca and Nero about Seneca's retirement and so on. All that to say that the Stoics developed this notion of avoiding pain, needless pain, or avoiding situations where one would commit some sort of moral outrage. This might even apply in Abraham's situation. It wouldn't necessarily from a legal perspective, but if Abraham felt so strongly about it, then the Stoics would say, rather than commit a moral outrage of some sort, it's better to take your own life. So, but I do think that what is interesting and what's important to remember is that this sets up now in the lives and in the writings of the Romans, and the Stoics in particular, this notion of the noble death, right? The noble death by suicide, right? That rather than do something terrible, I'm going to take my own life. And so the notion that one can achieve a degree of nobility or sort of claim some sort of moral high ground, if you will, by taking one's life as opposed to committing some sort of moral outrage, lays the foundation for martyrdom, which is going to be one of the main responses to civic or political oppression for those in the Jesus movement, and something for which the Roman world was, in some respects, and surprisingly, completely unprepared for. Right? So the Romans, the Stoic philosophy itself sets the preconditions for something that they're going to experience in a way that really stymied the Romans. Right? The notion that rather than commit some moral outrage or sin, if you will, it's better for me to take my own life, or rather to allow someone else to take my life. Okay, and that becomes the foundation for martyrdom. So in these letters here that we see some things that we're going to come back to. Augustine, for example, interestingly enough, or not Augustine, but Plutarch, is not an author that we're going to read, but Plutarch wrote letters to, for example, Homer, right? So the notion of writing letters to other literary figures is something that crops up again and again in the late antiquity, into the medieval, and into the Renaissance, right? The martyrdoms are going to play a crucial role, even into our day today. Martyrdom is something that is actively pursued, or something that is viewed in some traditions and communities as an alternative, right? As something that one can do. Right? So we're seeing the preconditions for this, the philosophical preconditions. You will note one last thing, and then we'll depart, and we'll start looking at a slightly different vision of the Roman world through the eyes of Virgil, and that is that Seneca's life himself. These letters that we read today were really a consequence of the time. At least scholars believe, are a consequence of the time that he spent after he asks Nero to be able to go into retirement and before he dies. So over a span of a couple of years. These are letters that reflect the attitude of a person who has been influential at the very highest levels of society in the Roman Empire, and who is now subject to the forces, the unpredictable, excessive whims of a Roman emperor. Nero had such power that he could do pretty much whatever he wanted to do. And if he felt that people threatened him in some way, he could have them killed. He could insist that they commit suicide. Right? This is the power that this individual had. And so they are an exercise, to a certain extent, a meditation on how one confronts absolute power, how one confronts a situation over which one has no control. How does one respond to extreme situations that not just Seneca, but others have experienced in the world? For example, during the Holocaust, or during the Nazi period, or fascism in other places. How does one respond to a system that is so out of control and unhitched and amoral that it can demand the deaths of its citizens. How do we respond to that? And Seneca is wrestling with this. He has the means, he has the stature, but he also has the proximity to the emperor that places him in a very perilous situation. In fact, he travels, in order to avoid Nero, in order to avoid the excesses of a Nero, he goes on the road. He's free. He's just free. Well, if they don't know where I am, the likelihood of their finding me and asking me to kill myself is a little less, right? So Seneca actually travels around, right? He's in order to stay away from the likelihood of Nero killing him, or arranging for his death, or demanding his suicide. So this is an incredibly intelligent, articulate person who finds himself in the most dire of circumstances. And he writes these letters to Lucilius, and that's why they're filled with these admonitions to separate oneself, to find leisure, to get away from it all, to build these sort of barriers, if you will, boundaries of one's civic engagement, to avoid the risks and the dangers of public life. And so they're filled with that. Seneca might have written differently 10 or 15 years earlier, but in these 2 years we see a reflections of a person who has truly been at the very seat of imperial power and now finds himself the victim, if you will, or at least the opposition, the resistance to this unbridled power of Nero. So they're very poignant letters, I think, from someone who is articulate and who is incredibly well educated and who brings to us a perspective on things that I hope none of us ever have to experience. We're going to read a little bit later in the semester. This is a little bit anticipatory of the work of Boethius, The Consolation of Philosophy, who, like Seneca, served at the very highest levels or stratum of civil society, and then finds himself imprisoned and sentenced to death. Right? How does one, having done one's best in life, suddenly find oneself in a situation where, for whatever reasons, politically or otherwise, one is facing one's death? And so Boethius is going to also give us another perspective on this. So, just to sort of situate this, thank you for your readings. When we're going to move into Virgil, and Virgil has a slightly different, you will see certain aspects of Epicureanism in there, you will see certain aspects of Stoicism, but you will also see aspects of Pythagoreanism, which we saw in Plato, right? So Virgil is going to have Aeneas go to the underworld, and he's going to experience his father and his ancestors, and more importantly and interestingly enough, people that are going to come after him, okay? His progeny he's going to encounter, which is a very different understanding of the universe than we see in Stoics. All right, have a great weekend. Thank you. Thank you for your letters. Thank you, Kylie, for running the show.